The morning of the dispersal sale, there were 24 starving horses nobody wanted, and they stood in a muddy holding pen at the back of the fairgrounds, with their hip bones showing, and their heads low, and the crowd that had come for the good stock, and the broke geldings and the papered mares up front, did not walk that far, because there was nothing back there but a debt somebody else had let go too long, and the smell of it, and the flies. They had come off a place 2 counties over, where a man had died in the winter, and his sons had let the animals go to bone before anyone thought to call the county. And now they were a single lot on the sale sheet. A lot the auctioneer read out fast and flat, the way a man reads a thing he is ashamed of. 24 head, no reserve, take them all or take none. And the ring went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when a beggar comes to a wedding. A buyer from the plant leaned on the rail with a paper cup of coffee and did not raise his hand yet because he did not have to. Because everyone in that arena knew the number those horses were worth was the number the plant would pay by the pound. And there was no other number, and there was no other man who would say one. Except there was. He stood at the back with his cap in his hand and his boots soaked through. And he raised one finger, not high, just enough. And he said a figure that was $40 over the plant. And the whole ring turned to look at him, the way you turn to look at a man who has coughed in church. His name was Eli Prentice, and he was 24 years old, 1 year for every horse, though he did not think of it that way then, and he had $1,100 to his name, and no plan for any of it. And the plant buyer looked at him for a long moment, and then set his coffee down on the rail, and shook his head once, the way you shake your head at a thing you have decided is not worth the fight, and the gavel came down, and Eli Prentice owned 24 horses, nobody else in that county would have carried home for free. And that was when Carl Detweiler, who ran the biggest feedlot on the North Road, and had a voice built for a room this size, laughed the kind of laugh that is meant to be heard, and he said, loud enough for the rail and the ring and the coffee stand to hear it, that the boy had just paid good money for 24 funerals, and that he ought to keep the backhoe warmed up, because he was going to be digging past Christmas. And a few men laughed with him, the way men laugh with the man who feeds their cattle. And Eli did not laugh, and did not argue. He only settled his cap back onto his head, and said, quiet, so that only the 2 men nearest him heard it. That's one approach, and he went to find the trailer he had borrowed, and the man who had said he would drive it. I want to stop here for one moment before we go up that gravel road with him, because I think there is a good chance you already know somebody who bought their own version of those 24 horses, somebody the whole room laughed at, and if that is you, or if it was ever you, do me a small favor and leave a like on this, so the story travels a little farther than it would on its own, and then leave a comment and tell me the name of the town or the city or the country you are watching from, because I read every single one of them, and there is something in me that needs to know how far a thing like this can carry, how many kitchens and cabs and late rooms it can reach, and then come back and stand with me at the fence, because the fence is where this whole thing ends up, though neither Eli nor Carl nor anybody at that sale could have known it yet. It took 3 trips in a stock trailer with a soft floor to get them all up the ridge, and the last of the light was gone by the time the last 4 came off the ramp and stood blinking in the yard of the old Prentice place, and the yard light hummed and drew moths, and the horses did not run because they did not have the run left in them. They only stood where he put them and looked at the dark hills with the flat, exhausted patience of animals that have stopped expecting anything, and Eli stood in the middle of them with a flake of hay in each hand and did not know yet that he had bought his whole life at that sale, and the plant's number, and the funerals, and the fence. The Prentice place had been empty for 2 years by then, since his grandfather went into the ground, and the great-aunt who had helped raise him, a woman named Verna, who was his grandfather's sister, and who said maybe 1/10 of what she thought, moved down to the little house at the foot of the drive, and let the big house and the barns go quiet. And Eli had come home in March with a duffel bag and a certificate from a farrier school he had never used, and a truck that was more rust than truck, and a habit, learned nowhere he could name, of writing things down in a spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He had come home, not because he had a plan, but because he had nowhere else that would have him, because the city job had ended, and the girl had ended, and the money had ended, all in the same 6 weeks, and the place at the top of the ridge was the one thing in the world nobody could take from him or sell out from under him. And so he had driven up the gravel with the windows down and the truck composing its own long obituary at every hill, and Werner had come out onto the porch of the little house, in the same work coat she had worn for 30 years, and looked at him, and said only, "Well," and gone back inside, and that was the whole of his welcome, and it had been enough. The barns were the strange thing. His grandfather had built them wrong. Everybody said so, and had always said so, that old Amos Prentice had built a barn, with its long low back turned to the west, and its open face to the east, dug into the slope so that half of it was underground, with thick stone walls at the base, and a run of narrow vents up high, and no proper loft, and a roofline that came down almost to the grass on the weather side. And men had told Amos his whole life that he had built a root cellar and called it a barn, and Amos had let them say it, and had gone on keeping stock in that barn through winters that killed animals in the big, bright, modern barns down on the flats. And nobody had ever put those two facts next to each other, because Amos was a quiet man, and did not put them next to each other for you. Eli put the horses in that barn the first night, because it was the only shelter standing that had a roof that would hold, and he noticed, without yet knowing what he was noticing, that the air inside it was still and even and warmer than the yard by a margin he could feel on the backs of his hands, and that the horses, when he penned them along the deep stone wall, stopped their shivering within the hour. In the morning he began the only work he knew how to do, which was to write down what he saw, and he wrote down which of the 24 could stand square, and which listed, and which would take grain, and which turned from it, and which had the dull, staring coat of an animal too far gone, and which had the faint grease of one that might come back, and he numbered them 1 through 24 in his notebook, because he had made himself a promise on the drive up that he would not name them, that a man who names 24 horses he might lose is a man building himself 24 funerals, just like Carl said. And so he held that line. He held that line hard, and I will tell you now that he almost held it. Werner came up the drive at midday, walking slow, with a bucket of something warm she had cooked down, a mash of her own, with things in it he did not ask about, and she went down the line of horses without a word, running her flat old hand along each barrel, and at the end of the line she stopped at the deep wall, where the air pooled warm, and she stood there a while. And then she said, "He built this barn for these," and Eli said, "For horses," and she said, "No, for the ones nobody would carry home. He always said the day would come, somebody would need a barn built for the ones nobody wanted." And she looked at Eli then, in a way she had not looked at him before, and she said, "There's a box of his papers under the seat of the church pew in the loft of the little barn, the one nobody ever climbs to, and you go read them before you decide you don't know what you're doing." And then she picked up her empty bucket and walked back down the drive, and that was the most words Eli had heard her say at one time in the whole of his life. The box under the pew seat was a wooden thing the size of a footlocker, with a lid that had swelled shut in the damp, and Eli worked it open with a screwdriver by lantern light after the horses were fed and watered on the 3rd night. And inside it was not treasure the way a boy imagines treasure. It was paper, ledgers and field books and loose sheets, tied in bundles with baling twine, all of it in his grandfather's hand, which was a small, upright, careful hand that pressed hard enough to emboss the back of every page. And Eli sat down on the loft boards with the lantern beside him and began to read, and he did not stop until the lantern guttered and he had to feel his way back down the ladder in the dark. What his grandfather had written, across 40 years of winters, was an argument. It was a quiet, patient, relentless argument for a way of keeping animals that the whole county had decided was worthless before Eli was born. And it was written not as a man argues in a room, but as a man argues with the ground, with numbers and dates and weights, and the plain record of what had happened when he did the thing everyone told him not to do. Amos had bought poor stock on purpose his whole life. He had gone to the sales and bought the lot at the back, the thin ones, the wormy ones, the ones off a dead man's place, and he had brought them up the ridge and put them in the barn he built wrong, and he had written down, in that hard little hand, exactly how you bring an animal back from the edge of nothing. And it was not the way the feed companies said, and it was not fast, and it was not something you could do with money instead of time. There was a line early in the oldest ledger that Amos had underlined, once, with a straight edge, so that the line under the words was as careful as the words themselves. And the line said, "The ground remembers what the barn forgets." And Eli read it 4 times, and did not know what it meant, and wrote it down in his own notebook anyway, because he had a feeling about it, the way you have a feeling about a key, before you have found the lock. There were pages on the barn itself, on why the long back went to the west, and why the face opened east, on how the earth held against the low walls kept a temperature the way a cellar keeps a temperature, never warm but never killing, and how the high vents pulled the bad air up and out, without ever letting a draft down onto a lying animal. And there were measurements, the exact height of the vents above the floor, the exact depth. Amos had dug the north wall into the slope, 41 inches, which he had circled, and a note beside it that said, "Less than this and the frost finds them, more and the air goes dead, 41. And Eli went out the next morning and measured the wall, and it was 41 inches, and he stood in the cold with the tape in his hand, and felt something move in his chest that he did not have a word for. There were pages on feeding a starved horse, on how you do not feed it, on how the thing that kills the ones nobody wanted is not the hunger they came in with, but the mercy of a fool who dumps grain in front of a gut that has forgotten how to work. And Amos had written out a schedule, so many handfuls, so many times a day, rising so slow across so many weeks, that it looked like nothing. It looked like starving them slower. And Eli followed it exactly, because he had decided, somewhere in that loft, that he would trust the dead man over the living ones, and by the end of the first week, he had lost 2 horses, the 2 that had come in worst, and he wrote their numbers in his book, and drew a line through them, and dug where the ground was soft, down past the old orchard, and did not tell Carl Detweiler, or anyone. And by the end of the 2nd week he had lost no more, and by the end of the 3rd week the horse he had numbered 9, a bay mare with a white sock and a look in her eye that had come back from somewhere far off, walked the length of the barn, and put her nose flat against his chest, and left it there. And he stood very still, and he did not name her. He held that line. He held that line right up until she did it again the next morning, and the morning after that, and then he named her Ada, after nothing, after a sound, and he wrote it in the book beside the number 9, with no explanation, because there was no explaining it, and that was the one. That was the only one he named. The other 21 stayed numbers, and he would tell you if you asked that this was discipline, but Verna, when she saw the name in the book, only said, and went on shelling her peas, because Verna knew what it was, and it was not discipline. The word got down the ridge the way words do, which is to say, through Loretta at the gas station on the county road, who ran the register and the coffee pot, and the entire nervous system of that end of the county, from a stool by the window. And by April everyone who bought gas or cigarettes or a lottery ticket knew that the Prentice boy had brought home the dead man's horses, and put them in the root cellar, and was feeding them by the handful like a man rationing for a siege. And the story, as Loretta told it, was a story about a fool, and Carl Detweiler helped her tell it, because Carl came in most mornings, and Carl had appointed himself the chorus of Eli's ruin, and he would stand by the coffee and say that the boy was too proud to sell those horses to the plant, like a sane man, and was going to watch them die slow, instead out of vanity, and that the barn he was keeping them in would kill whatever the hunger didn't. That old Amos had been half a crank, and the boy was shaping up to be a whole one, and Loretta would say, "Oh, Carl," in the tone that means go on, and Carl would go on. And the thing about Carl that you have to understand, so that you do not make him a cartoon, is that Carl was not a cruel man, and was not even a wrong man most of the time. Carl fed 400 head on the North Road, and did it well, and had built what he had from a single leased pasture over 30 hard years. And Carl believed, the way a man believes the thing that made him, that the animal business was a business of scale and speed and leverage, that you bought feed on credit and put weight on fast and sold before the interest ate you. That sentiment was for people who could afford to lose. And from inside that belief, the sight of a boy nursing 24 skeletons by the handful in a hole in the ground was not just foolish, it was an insult. It was a slow-motion argument that Carl's whole life was the wrong shape, and Carl could feel that even if he could not have said it, and so he mocked it, because a man will mock the thing that frightens him before he will look at it. Eli heard about all of it, because you always hear, and he did not go down to the gas station to defend himself, and he did not stop buying his few things there either. He went in for his bread and his coffee filters the same as ever, and let Loretta look at him. And one morning Carl was there and said to him direct, across the coffee, so the room could hear, "When you going to quit playing and take them to the plant, boy, before they suffer any more on your account?" And Eli poured his coffee and put the lid on it and said, "They're not suffering, Carl. They're eating." And Carl said, "They're eating you into the ground is what they're eating." And Eli said, "That's one approach," and paid Loretta and left. And Loretta said after the door shut, "That boy don't say much." And Carl said, "Dead men don't say much either," and laughed. And nobody laughed with him quite as much as they had at the sale, because by April some of them had driven the ridge road on purpose to see the horses, and the horses were standing in the little east pasture in the morning sun with their heads up. Because that was the other thing that had begun to happen, the thing that does not make a good story at the gas station, because it is slow, which is that the horses were coming back, not fast. Amos's ledger did not permit fast, but the coats were tightening, and the eyes were clearing, and the 15 that had been the strongest of the lot were carrying flesh over their ribs for the first time in anyone's memory, and Ada the bay mare had a shine on her by May that made a man who knew horses stop his truck at the fence, and one such man did stop, a farrier from down south named Odell, who was the best in 3 counties, and did not have time for anybody, and he stood at Eli's fence with his hands in his pockets, and looked a long time, and then said, "Whose feet did these?" And Eli said, "Mine." And Odell looked at Eli, and looked at the mare's feet again, at the way they had been brought back level and sound, from the long-toed cracked ruin they must have come in as, and he said, "You did school for this?" And Eli said, "I did, never used it." And Odell nodded slow and said, "You're using it now." And he gave Eli his card, which Odell did not do, and drove off. And that was the first thread of a rope that would take 4 years to braid, one craftsman recognizing another across a fence and carrying the word of it away in his truck without being asked to. By the second winter, the 21 that had lived were not the horses that had come off the trailer, and a man passing on the ridge road who had not seen the sale would not have believed they were the same animals, or believed the story if you told it. And Eli had begun, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, to do the thing his grandfather's ledgers had really been about, which was not saving horses, but making them worth something by the slow, patient craft of it. Because a horse brought back right, a horse whose feet were made sound and whose gut was rebuilt handful by handful, and whose mind was let to heal in a barn where nothing ever frightened it, is not a rescue. It is a using horse, of a quiet, honest kind, that people who actually ride and work will pay for, and they will pay more for it than for a flashy sale barn horse, because it is sound in the foot and calm in the head, and owes nothing to anybody. And Amos had known this, and had written it down in a line Eli underlined in his own book now, the second underlined line in the whole story, which said, "You are not selling the horse, you are selling the years you put in it, and nobody can undercut your years." Eli sold 3 horses that second spring, quietly, by word of mouth, to people Odell sent, and he priced them at a number that made Loretta gasp when she heard it, and made Carl Detweiler set down his coffee. And every one of the 3 sold at the asking, with no haggle, because the people who came to look were people who knew. And they put their hand on the horse's neck, and looked at its feet and its eye, and did the math on what it would have taken to make it, and paid the number. And Eli took that money, and did the thing that Carl could not forgive him for, even more than the horses, which was that he did not spend it. He did not buy a new truck. He did not buy a squeeze chute or a skid steer, or any of the things a young man buys to tell the county he has arrived. He fixed the fence. He put the money into wire and posts and gates, and into the fence that ran the whole perimeter of the ridge, 4 strands where the old 2 had sagged, corner posts set in concrete, a fence built the way his grandfather built the barn, which is to say, built once, and built right, and built to outlast the man building it. And Verna watched him string it in the cold, and said one afternoon, from the porch, with her knitting in her lap, "Your granddad always said, a man's fence is the truest thing he'll ever say." And Eli stopped with the come-along in his hand and said, "What's it say?" And Verna said, "It says here is what I will take care of, and everything on the far side of it is somebody else's argument." And she went back to her knitting, and Eli went back to his fence, and he built it all the way around, 6 weeks of winter work, alone, and there was a stretch on the north line where the ridge fell away toward the Detweiler leasehold, and the dry timber came right up to the boundary, and Eli, reading his grandfather again by lantern, found a page about that very stretch, about how Amos, every single fall, had cleared a strip inside the north fence, cut and raked, and burned it down to bare dirt in a band, as wide as the barn was long, and had written beside it, "The ridge burns from the west, in a dry fall, and the fence won't stop fire, but the bare ground will. Keep the strip, the ground remembers." And there it was again, the ground remembers, the line from the very first page, and Eli sat back on the loft boards and understood for the first time that it had never been a poem, it had been an instruction. He cleared the strip that second fall, even though it had not been dry and there was no fire, and Carl, who saw the smoke of the burning, drove up the ridge to make sure the fool boy had not lost control of it, and stood at the new fence looking at the black band of cleared ground running along the boundary and said, "What in the world are you doing?" And Eli said, "Firebreak." And Carl looked at the green wet timber all around, and the grey wet sky, and said, "There ain't been a fire on this ridge in 20 years. And Eli said, "My granddad cut this strip every fall for 40. And Carl said, "And your granddad died broke in a root cellar." And Eli said, "He died in his own bed on his own ground, owing nobody." Carl, "That's not broke. That's just quiet." And Carl did not have an answer for that, and got in his truck, and drove back down, and it would be the last unkind thing Carl Detweiler ever said to him, though neither of them knew it, and the prediction Carl had made at the sale about funerals and backhoes was still hanging in the air over the whole thing, waiting to be answered. And it would be answered, but it would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. The 3rd year was the year the reputation went from a thread to a rope, and it happened the way Amos would have wanted it to, which is to say without a single dollar spent on telling anyone anything, because Odell the farrier had carried the word south, and a woman who trained working horses for the big outfits had come up the ridge on Odell's say-so, and bought 2, and she had put them under real work, and they had held, sound and calm, through a season that broke lesser horses, and she had told the outfit she trained for, and the outfit had sent a man, and the man had stood at Eli's fence the same way Odell had 2 years before, with his hands in his pockets, and taken his slow measure of the ridge and the barn, and the horses standing quiet in the east pasture. And he had said, "I heard you don't advertise," and Eli said, "No." And the man said, "I heard you won't take a note, that you make people pay cash and you won't finance." And Eli said, "That's right." And the man said, "Why?" "Because a note would move 10 of these a year off this ridge." And Eli was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing his grandfather had written on the inside cover of the oldest ledger, the thing that was becoming the spine of him. He said, "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and I don't know the future well enough to tell it anything." And the man looked at him for a long moment and then laughed. But it was not Carl's laugh. It was the other kind, the kind that is really a man conceding something, and he bought 4 horses for cash that day and shook Eli's hand and said, You're going to be a problem for a lot of people who do this the fast way." And Eli said, "I'm not trying to be a problem for anybody." And the man said, "I know, that's what'll make you one," and drove off. And the money from those 4, and the 2 before, and the others that trickled off the ridge that 3rd year, Eli again did not spend on himself. He put it into the ground. He put it into the 2 lower pastures that had gone to broom and cedar since Amos got too old to fight them, and he cleared them and limed them and seeded them back to the grasses Amos had listed in a field book from 1974, the exact mix, because there was a page about that too, about how the ridge grass was not an accident, but a thing Amos had built over decades to feed a horse without foundering it. Low and tough and slow, the ground remembers, and Eli built it back, and Verna, who was slower now and did not come up the drive as often, watched from her porch the green come back into the lower fields, and said to Eli one evening when he came down to check on her, "He'd have liked to see that." And Eli said, "I know." And Verna said, "You're doing it the long way." And Eli said, "Is there another way?" And Verna said, "Everybody thinks there is. That's why there's so few doing it the long way." And she was quiet then, and she said, "I'm proud of you." And Eli went very still, because Verna had never in his life said that to him or to anyone he had ever heard of. Verna hoarded that word the way a dry country hoards rain, and he did not know what to do with it, so he did what she would have done. He said nothing, and let it sit in the air the length of time it had earned, and then he fixed the loose board on her porch step, before he went back up the ridge, because that was a thing you could do with a feeling like that. You could fix a step with it. That fall the county cut back its fire crews to save money, and the paper ran a small item about it that nobody read closely, and the summer had been the driest anyone could remember, the creeks down to string, and the timber on the west slopes gone the color of a paper bag. And Eli read the sky the way his grandfather had taught him to through the ledgers, and he cut his firebreak strip wider than he ever had, twice the width, and burned it down to bare dirt in the still cold mornings of October. And Carl saw the smoke again from the North Road, and this time Carl did not drive up, because Carl had 1,000 things to worry about. Carl had bought heavy on credit that year, the way he always did, and the drought had run his feed bill up past anything he had planned for, and Carl was lying awake at night, doing the arithmetic of a man who had told the future what it had to do, and was finding out the future had its own ideas. And Carl did not have time to worry about a boy burning a strip of grass on a wet year habit. And so the strip got cut, and the firebreak got laid, and the 3rd year turned toward winter, with the whole ridge dry as tinder, and the fence built, and the ground bare, where Amos had said to keep it bare, and everything was in place. Everything Amos had written down across 40 years was in place on the ridge, and nobody living knew it but Eli. And I want you to hold the picture of that bare, black strip of ground along the north fence, because in about 6 weeks, a wall of fire 40 feet high was going to come up the west slope in the middle of the night, driven by a wind out of the drought, and it was going to run this whole country, and the only question anybody was going to be asking by morning was where it stopped and why. It started the way those things start, small and far off, and other people's problem. A downed line on the west end of the county, in the dead dry middle of a November night, with a wind behind it that had been building for 2 days, and by the time the first trucks got to it, there were no trucks enough, because the county had cut the crews, and the fire got into the timber on the west slopes and stood up, and began to walk east along the ridges the way fire walks, when the land has been waiting all summer to burn, and Eli woke to the smell of it, before he heard anything. Woke in the dark to that smell, and was out on the porch in his socks, before he was all the way awake, and the whole western sky was the wrong color. A low orange throb behind the near ridge, like a second and terrible dawn coming from the wrong side of the world, and he could hear it now, a sound under the wind that was not the wind, a low freight train sound that a man never forgets once he has heard it, and he stood on the porch for exactly as long as it took, to understand what he was seeing, and then he moved. And he did not move the way a panicked man moves. He moved the way a man moves who has read the instructions, because he had. because somewhere in those ledgers his grandfather had written down what to do the night the ridge burned, and Eli had read it and copied it into his own book, without ever quite believing he would need it. He did not try to move the horses. That was the first thing, and it was the thing every instinct in his body screamed against, because the instinct is to open the gates and run them off the mountain ahead of the fire, and Amos had written, in a hand that was harder pressed than usual, as if he had learned this the worst way, "Do not run them. A running horse runs into the fire as easy as a way. Put them in the barn. The barn is stone and dug in, and it will hold. Trust the barn." And Eli ran to the barn and brought them in. All 21 and Ada brought them into the deep stone barn, dug into the east slope, with its back to the west, and the fire. And he wet down the bedding, and the doors from the cistern, the way the ledger said, and he blocked the high vents on the west side, and left the east ones open, the way Amos had drawn it. And the horses came into the barn without fighting him, because it was the place where nothing had ever frightened them in 3 years of their lives, and he shut them into the dark stone belly of the hill their protection had been building toward for 4 decades. And then he went out to the north fence, with a shovel and the tractor, and he ran water, and he watched the fire come. And it came. It came up the west slope and over the near ridge, and down into the draw, between and up his own western pasture faster than a man can run. A wall of it, and the heat of it, reached across the whole ridge and pushed him back with his arm across his face, and it ran up through the western fields, eating the tall grass, and the cedar, and the fence posts, the fence Eli had built, burning right along the wire, and it came on toward the buildings and the barn and everything, and Eli stood at the north break with his heart going like a hammer, and did the only thing left to do, which was to trust a dead man, and the fire hit the wide black strip of bare ground along the north line, where nothing grew, and there was nothing to eat, and it faltered. You could see it falter. The wall of it that had come up the western slope 40 feet high dropped down to nothing at the edge of that bare strip, like a wave running up onto flat sand, because fire is not magic. Fire is only a thing eating fuel, and where Eli had cut the fuel to bare dirt, the fire had nothing to cross on, and it guttered and crawled and threw sparks that Eli and the water beat down one by one through the rest of that night. And it went around. It went north and south, looking for a way across, and found the break held the whole length of the north line, the way Amos had said it would. And by the grey of morning, the fire had passed on east, to burn other men's timber and other men's fences, and it had taken the western third of the Prentice place down to ash, the outbuildings, and the western pastures, and 1/2 mile of new fence. But it had stopped at the strip. It had stopped at Eli's fence and his firebreak, and the barn stood, dug into its hill with its stone back to the burned world, and inside it, 21 horses and a bay mare named Ada stood in the dark and the still even air, and were alive. The thing about a fire is that it draws a map, and in the grey light of that morning, the whole county could read the map it had drawn, and what the map said was plain, and it was terrible, and it did not care about anyone's opinion, because the fire had run the ridges east through the night, and it had taken Carl Detweiler's North Road leasehold entire, the dry pasture and the hay barns Carl had filled on credit against the drought, and it had come down off the ridge and burned Carl's feed stores, and killed stock that could not be moved fast enough in the dark, and Carl Detweiler, who had told the future what it had to do, stood in the ash of his own operation at dawn, with the note still owed on all of it, and nothing left to pay it with. And up the ridge, above him, standing green and black in a hard line, was the Prentice place, burned on its western third, and whole on its east, the barn standing, the horses alive, the fence holding along a strip of bare ground that an old man had cut every fall for 40 years, while the whole county laughed at him for a crank. The fire drew that map, and everyone read it. Loretta at the gas station read it, because the men came in grey-faced and smelling of smoke for 3 days after, and there was only one story now, and it was not the story about the fool boy. It was the story about how the fire stopped at the Prentice fence, and how the boy had done some old thing his granddad taught him. Cut a strip, and put the horses in the root cellar barn, and how not one of the 24 he saved was lost to it, and how Carl Detweiler, who had laughed loudest, was burned out down to the note. And Eli did not say a word about any of it. He did not go down to the gas station to be told he had been right. He spent those 3 days doing what a man does after a fire, walking his black western fields with a shovel, putting out the smoulders, restringing the half-mile of burned fence, tending the horses who had come out of the barn, skittish for a day, and then settled, because the barn had taught them their whole lives that they were safe. And he wrote it all down in his book, the numbers, the losses, the fence, the strip, the way the fire had faltered at the bare ground, exactly the way the ledger said, and beside it, he wrote the line one more time, "The ground remembers," and this time he understood it all the way down. It was maybe a week after, when the ash had cooled and the shock had worn to the dull business of what comes next, that a truck came slow up the ridge road one evening and stopped at the yard, and it was Carl Detweiler, and Carl got out of the truck and stood by it a moment with his hat in his hands, and Eli came off the porch, and the two men stood in the yard in the failing light, with the smell of old smoke still on everything, and Carl looked at the barn and the fence and the horses in the east pasture, and he did not say any of the things a man rehearses. He just said, straight out, flat, "I was wrong," and he did not make a large production out of it. He did not explain himself, or soften it, or ask for anything. He said it the way you set down a heavy thing. "You have carried too far. I was wrong. About the horses, and about your granddad, and about you. I said funerals, and it was me that had the funerals." And Eli did not gloat, and did not wave it off either. He let it sit in the air, the length of time it had earned. And then he said, "You want to see the barn?" And Carl said, "Yeah, I do." And Eli walked him into the deep stone barn, dug into the hill, and showed him the vents at 41 inches, and the earth-held wall, and the strip of bare ground out the north door. And Carl, who had fed animals for 30 years, and thought he knew the whole of it, stood in that barn and learned something. And when they came out, Carl said, "Your granddad wrote all this down." And Eli said, 40 years of it. And Carl was quiet, and then he said, "I never wrote down a thing in my life. I kept it all in my head and up on a marker board, and it burned." And Eli understood that Carl was not just talking about the fire, and he did not say anything. And Carl put his hat back on and said, "If you ever," and did not finish it, and got in his truck and drove down the ridge. And that was Carl's conversion, and there was no ceremony in it, and it was complete. Verna did not last the winter after the fire, and there was nothing hard in the way she went, which is the mercy that is sometimes given to people who have spent themselves carefully. She simply got smaller and slower through December and took to her bed in January, and one cold, clear morning did not wake, and Eli found her when he came down with her breakfast, sitting up against her pillows with her knitting in her lap and her face turned toward the window that looked up the ridge to the big house and the barn, and he stood in the doorway a long time and did not go to her right away, because there is a kind of quiet you do not want to be the one to break. And then he went and sat on the edge of the bed and took her cold hand and held it. And outside, the horses were calling to be fed, and the truck down at the shed was composing its own long obituary in the cold. And Eli sat with the last person alive who had known his grandfather, the last one who had seen the whole long arc of the thing, from Amos building the wrong barn to the fire stopping at the fence, and he let her go the way she would have wanted, without a production. In her lap under the knitting was an envelope, sealed, with his name on it in Verna's hand, and it had clearly been there some time waiting, and Eli did not open it that day or the next. He carried it in his shirt pocket next to the notebook through the whole business of burying her, and they buried her up the ridge next to Amos, in the little fenced plot under the oak. And the surprise of that morning, the thing that undid Eli more than the grave did, was who came. Because they came. They came up the ridge road in their trucks and stood in the cold. Loretta from the gas station, and Odell the farrier who had driven 3 hours, and the woman who trained the working horses, and the man from the big outfit who did not finance, and old men Eli half knew, and men his own age he did not. And Carl Detweiler stood at the back in a clean shirt with his hat in his hands, and they stood around the grave of a woman most of them had barely spoken to, and Eli understood, standing there, that they had not come for Verna, or not only for Verna, they had come for him, that the ridge had corrected its judgment all the way, and this was the ceremony of it, this roll call of the living standing on his ground in the cold. And when it was done, and they had gone, he climbed to the loft of the little barn, and sat on the church pew, where the box of ledgers had been, and opened Verna's envelope, and inside was a single sheet in her spare hand, and it said, "The place is yours. It was always going to be yours. Amos knew it, and I knew it. We were just waiting for you to be somebody we could give it to." And under that, 2 words, "Keep going," and nothing else. And Eli sat with it a long time, and then he wrote the 2 words in his notebook under everything else, and folded her letter into the front of the oldest ledger, where his grandfather's underlined line waited, and the 2 of them made a kind of sentence together across 50 years. The ground remembers. Keep going. There was a boy by then who had started coming around, a lean, quiet 14-year-old named Toby, from a hard house down on the flats, who had appeared at the fence one Saturday the summer before the fire, and asked if there was work, and Eli had said there was always work, and had put him on it without any speech about proving himself, had handed him a horse and a hoof-pick the first day the way you hand a thing to somebody you have already decided is capable. And the boy had good hands. Eli saw it that first day. The horses went quiet for the boy the way they went quiet for Eli, and Verna had seen it too before she died, had watched the boy work a colt from her porch and said to Eli, "That's the one." And Eli had said, "One what?" And Verna had said, "Don't be slow. You know exactly what. That's the one you hand it to. He's got the hands." And Eli had known she was right, the way you know a thing you have been avoiding knowing. And so in the years after the fire, and after Verna, Eli did with Toby what Amos had done with the ledgers, and what Verna had done with her sparse, hard-won words. He handed it forward. He taught the boy the barn and the strip, and the slow handful feeding, and the field book grasses, and the whole patient craft of making worth out of the thing nobody wanted. And he did not do it in speeches. He did it in the work, and he let the boy read the ledgers, and one winter evening he found Toby up in the loft by the lantern, with the oldest ledger open on his knees, reading the underlined line, and the boy looked up and said, "The ground remembers. What's it mean?" And Eli sat down on the pew beside him, the way Verna had once sat, and did not answer it straight. "Because it was not a thing you could answer straight," he said. "Cut the north strip with me next fall, and you'll know." And the boy nodded and went back to reading, and Eli watched him read his grandfather's hand by lantern light, and felt the weight of the whole thing settle onto his shoulders, the way a coat settles. Not heavy exactly, just there, just his to carry now and then to hand on. The reputation of the ridge only grew in those years, and it grew the same slow, honest way it had started, one craftsman telling another, no advertising, no notes, cash only, grown only as fast as the work could bear, and Eli turned down more than he sold and put the money into the ground, the way Amos had, into fence and grass and the barn, and the operation that Carl Detweiler had once run big and fast on credit and lost in a night. Eli ran small and slow and whole, and could not lose, because he owed no one, and the future had nothing to hold over him, and Carl himself, who rebuilt smaller after the fire and never quite got back to where he had been, and was maybe better for it, sent people up the ridge now, sent them saying, "Go see the Prentice boy. He does it the old way, and the old way works. I ought to know." And every fall, Eli and Toby cut the north strip, and every winter they brought the horses into the stone barn against the cold, and every spring the poor stock came up the ridge in the trailer, the thin ones and the wormy ones and the ones off the back lot that the plant would have taken by the pound, and the ground took them, and the barn took them, and the years took them, and made them worth something, and it never once looked like much from the road. It never looked like anything but a young man, and a boy, and some horses, and a great deal of patience, which is exactly what it was. The morning Eli Prentice went back to the sale, it had been 10 years to the season since the first one, and he did not go to buy, or he did not go only to buy. He went to close a loop he had been carrying around all that time. And Toby drove because Eli had given him the truck by then, a better truck, and they parked at the fairgrounds and walked in through the same gates. And it was all the same. The ring and the coffee stand and the good stock up front. And at the back, in the muddy holding pen where nobody walked, there was a lot of thin horses off a dead man's place, 6 of them this time, standing with their hip bones showing and their heads low in the harsh light. A lot, the auctioneer read out fast and flat and ashamed. And the plant buyer leaned on the rail with his coffee, and the room went quiet the way it always goes quiet. And it was 10 years ago, exactly, except that this time, when the ring turned its tired, uninterested eyes toward the back, it was not a broke boy in soaked boots that it found. It was Eli Prentice, and half the room knew who he was, and knew what his hand going up meant. And when he raised one finger, not high, just enough, and said his number over the plant, nobody laughed. Nobody laughed at all. And the plant buyer looked at him, and set down his coffee, and shook his head once, and let it go. And the gavel came down, and Eli owned 6 more horses nobody else would have carried home. And here is the thing I have been bringing you all this way to stand and see, the debt he had come to pay, because as they loaded the 6 thin horses into the trailer, an old man came slow across the lot, and it was the auctioneer, retired now, who had read out that first lot 10 years ago, in the ashamed, flat voice, and he stood by the trailer and watched Eli work and said, "I remember you. You're the one bought the dead man's whole string that year. Everybody said you were a fool, and Eli said, 'That's right.' And the old man said, 'Whatever happened to those horses?' And Eli latched the trailer gate on the 6 new thin ones and looked at the old man and said, 'Plainly, the way you offer a fact for consideration, 22 of the 24 lived. I still have 4 of them. One of them's an old bay mare named Ada. She's out on the ridge in the good grass right now, getting fat and doing nothing, and she's earned it. And the fire that burned this whole county 9 years ago stopped at my fence because my granddad taught me where to cut the ground, and I've sold horses off that ridge to every serious outfit in 3 states, and I never advertised one, and I never took a note for one, and this boy here has the hands, and the place'll be his someday the way it was mine, and I owe all of it to a lot of horses nobody in that ring would carry home for free. So every few years I come back and I buy the lot nobody wants, and I take them up the ridge, and I pay the debt." And the old auctioneer looked at him a long moment, and then looked at the 6 thin horses in the trailer, and back at Eli, and he said, "That's a strange kind of debt." And Eli said, "It's the only kind worth owing," and got in the truck. And they drove up the ridge in the evening, with 6 more horses that nobody wanted. Up the gravel road, that the truck no longer composed obituaries on, because it was a good truck now, past the burned line that had long since gone back to grass, past the north strip cut black and bare against the coming fall, up to the stone barn dug into the hill that an old man had built wrong, on purpose for exactly these, for the ones nobody would carry home. And they backed the trailer to the ramp, and let the 6 thin horses off into the yard under the humming light, and the 6 stood where they were put, and looked at the dark hills with the flat, exhausted patience of animals that have stopped expecting anything, not knowing yet that they had just been carried up into the one place in the world that had been waiting 40 years to prove them worth something, and Toby carried the hay, and Eli stood in the middle of the 6 with a flake in each hand, and up on the ridge, Ada lifted her head in the good grass, and that is where I will leave them, in the yard, in the light, at the start of it all over again. And now it is your turn to do the small thing I asked. So if this story reached something in you, share it with somebody who has been underestimated, somebody a whole room once laughed at, because they need to hear how it can go, and then leave me a comment and tell me about the stubborn thing in your own life that people laughed at you for holding on to. The barn you built wrong on purpose. The lot nobody wanted that you carried home anyway, because I read every one of them, and there is a part of me that believes the ground remembers those too, and I would like to know what you are keeping.